The tea was still warm in my hands when my daughter-in-law shouted, "Get her out, she's just an old leech." Still, I didn't look up, I only traced the rim of my cup with one finger, slow and even. As her voice cracked the quiet, the scent of jasmine from my own garden crept in like memory. The same jasmine I planted the week she moved in, when this house still felt like mine. That's when I remembered, it is mine, my name on every deed she never bothered to read. She called me a burden in my own home, so I let the silence hand her the truth. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Maggie sat in her favorite armchair by the window, the soft hum of the old clock ticking in the background, a sound that had always comforted her. The afternoon light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long, graceful shadows across the room. She had been staring out, lost in thought, tracing the patterns in the wood of the coffee table. A quiet morning had turned into a quiet afternoon, and she found herself savoring the silence, the kind of silence that had always been hers before things had started to change. But today the silence was shattered. The door to the living room swung open and Rachel stormed in, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, the kind of sound that could only mean trouble. Maggie didn't even have time to react before Rachel's voice rang out, cutting through the air like a knife. "Get up, Maggie," Rachel sneered, her face contorted in disgust. "You need to leave now." Maggie blinked, her heart lurching in her chest, but she didn't say a word. Her eyes flickered to John, who was standing just behind Rachel, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. As usual, as always. Rachel continued, her voice rising. "You're a financial burden, you know that? A leech, an old leech living off my family. Do you even understand how much you're draining us? It's not fair." Maggie's breath caught in her throat, but she remained still, her gaze focused on the floor. She felt the heat of the insult rising in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She had heard those words before in different forms, in different moments, but never like this, never with this venom, this hate. Never from her daughter-in-law, the woman who was supposed to be family. John didn't meet her eyes, his gaze shifted to the side, anywhere but at his mother, and Maggie felt a wave of cold disappointment wash over her. His silence was louder than anything Rachel could have said. Rachel's words continued, cutting through the quiet like a broken record, as if trying to break her spirit. "You've been here long enough, you've overstayed your welcome. I don't care what you think you're entitled to, but this is our home now, you have to go." Sophie's voice broke through the tension, high and tremulous. "Mom, stop!" She stepped forward, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and concern. "Grandma doesn't have anywhere else to go, you can't just throw her out." Rachel shot her daughter a cold look, her lips curling into a sneer. "Sophie, you don't understand, you're just a kid, this isn't your problem." Her eyes flickered back to Maggie, narrowing with something almost resembling contempt. "But it's mine, and I'm done with it." Maggie closed her eyes briefly, the sting of Rachel's words settling deep inside her. She wanted to say something, to shout, to argue, but something inside of her told her to hold back, to let the storm pass. Rachel was raging and John was silent. It wasn't worth it, not yet. The quiet came again, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of before. It was thick with tension, heavy with unsaid words. Sophie's shoulders slumped, her face twisted with a mixture of anger and helplessness. Maggie could see the pain in her eyes, but Sophie was too young to fully understand what was happening. Maggie could only offer her a small, reassuring smile, a smile that spoke volumes of everything she couldn't say right now. Without a word, Maggie stood up slowly from her armchair, the motion deliberate, controlled. Her legs felt steady beneath her, though her heart was pounding. She didn't look at John. She didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes, just like his avoidance. "I'll go to my room," Maggie said, her voice steady, though it trembled slightly on the edges. She didn't want Rachel to see how deeply her words had cut, how deeply her betrayal stung. Not yet. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the living room, her steps slow and measured, her hand gripping the doorframe for a brief second before she closed the door behind her. The click of the door was final, an exclamation point to the conversation she hadn't wanted to have but had been forced into. She sank down on her bed, staring at the faded quilt, her thoughts a chaotic swirl. She had Neve. R felt so alone in her life. A part of her wanted to scream, to let it all out, to demand the respect she knew she deserved, but she couldn't, not yet. Maggie knew this was just the beginning. This was only the first battle, and she wasn't going to lose, not this time. She closed her eyes, her mind already racing toward the next steps, already thinking of how to regain control. She wasn't going to be anyone's burden, not anymore. And with that thought, a new resolve began to form deep within her. She might have been silent today, but that wouldn't last forever. She was going to fight back. But first, she needed to gather her strength. The door creaked softly as Sophie peeked her head in, her face etched with worry. "Grandma?" she asked quietly, her voice so small it almost broke Maggie's heart. Maggie opened her eyes, meeting her granddaughter's gaze. She offered another faint smile, one that was tinged with both sadness and determination. "I'm okay, sweetheart, just give me a little time." Sophie nodded, but Maggie could see the concern still lingering in her eyes. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. And Maggie knew, as she sat in her room in the silence, that the game was about to change. The evening settled quietly over the house, the once cozy corners now feeling foreign to Maggie. She could hear the faint murmur of voices from the living room, Rachel and John, but she didn't need to eavesdrop to know what they were talking about. It was always the same conversations that left her feeling smaller, quieter, as if she was nothing more than a nuisance in the lives of the people she had loved. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unopened bills and papers. The scent of coffee hung in the air, but it didn't bring her comfort tonight. Her hands trembled as they hovered over the papers, as if the weight of everything pressing down on her was too much to bear. She hadn't expected anything different from Rachel, not really. But hearing the words, draining their money, a burden, felt like a blow she hadn't been prepared for. "She's just a nuisance," Rachel's voice floated faintly down the hallway. "All she does is take, she's not even contributing, it's like she's taking up space for nothing." John's voice was soft, almost apologetic. "I know, but I just don't want to upset her. She's my mom, you know." His voice trailed off, a familiar helplessness in it that Maggie had grown all too used to over the years. "I don't care," Rachel snapped. "She's draining us dry, and I can't take it anymore. We can't keep living like this, John. I'm done." Maggie's heart sank at the words, even though she knew they were coming. She had known Rachel's bitterness for months now, perhaps longer, but hearing it so plainly, so openly, felt different. It was a rejection of everything she had done for this family, a rejection of her love, her sacrifices, and most painfully, her place in their lives. Her hands clenched into fists on the table, the sound of John's quiet defense echoing in her ears. The silence in the aftermath of Rachel's words felt suffocating. Maggie let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the weight of the years of sacrifice and the loss of respect she had quietly endured. "Enough." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she moved toward the phone. She couldn't keep waiting for someone to stand up for her, no more passive acceptance. It was time to take action. The thought of her own helplessness angered her, and that anger began to build into something else, something stronger. Her fingers hesitated over the dial, then she pressed the numbers with purpose. "Hello, Sarah?" Maggie's voice was low, but the sharpness in it was unmistakable. "I need your advice. It's time to take control of my life." Sarah's voice, familiar and warm, crackled through the line. "Maggie, what's going on?" "I need to figure out how to secure my future. I can't keep living like this, under their thumb. I need legal advice, something that will ensure I can keep my place here, protect myself, and not end up being tossed aside." Maggie paused, feeling the weight of her words settle. It's time to do something. There was a long silence on the other end, then Sarah's voice softened. "I think it's time you spoke to an attorney. You have every right to protect yourself and your home, Maggie. You don't have to put up with this. You've worked hard for everything you have." Maggie's chest tightened, the first real spark of hope igniting inside her. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "I'm not going to be anyone's burden anymore." "Good," Sarah replied. "Take the steps you need, Maggie. Don't let them push you out." Maggie ended the call and sat back down at the table. The kitchen was still, the clock ticking away in the background, but now the silence felt different. It wasn't stifling, it was filled with possibility. She felt the weight of the world begin to shift. The next few days said in a blur. Maggie spent her evenings poring over documents, her mind sharp and focused as she sifted through her finances. The house, the accounts, the investments, all of it was hers. She had spent years building a foundation, but now she needed to fortify it, make sure that no one could take it from her. She spent hours on the phone with various attorneys, gathering information, asking questions. The more she learned, the more she realized how much control she truly had. But there was still so much to do, so many steps to take. The house, her house, wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol, a refuge, and Maggie was determined to make sure it stayed that way. Late one night, as she was organizing a pile of papers, Maggie paused. The weight of what she was about to do settled on her like a heavy cloak. For the first time in years, she was standing up for herself, not just for her own sake, but for Sophie's too. She wasn't just reclaiming her life, she was securing a future for her granddaughter. She glanced at a picture of Sophie, smiling brightly in the frame beside the stack of papers. "This is for you too, darling." Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her back to reality. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the caller ID. It was Sarah. "Hello," Maggie answered, her voice steady. "Maggie, I have news. I think I've found an attorney who can help you with the next step in securing your property rights. He's good, really good, but we need to act quickly." Maggie felt a thrill run through her. This was it. "Send me the details, I'm ready," she said, the words flowing out more confidently than she had ever imagined. The moment she hung up, her resolve solidified. No more waiting, no more being pushed around. This was the start of something new, something powerful. She walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street. A new chapter was beginning, and for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt a spark of excitement flicker in her chest. She wasn't just going to survive, she was going to fight back. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room as Maggie sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edges of the papers scattered before her. The house was still, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, constant reminder of time passing and the weight of what was at stake. Maggie had spent the last few days organizing her finances, but something still gnawed at her, an unsettled feeling that she was missing a piece of the puzzle. She had made progress, real progress, sorting through bank statements and tax records, but something was off. Rachel's accusations of Maggie being a burden had burned into her memory, leaving her wondering, where's the money going? It was clear Rachel wasn't being truthful about the family's finances. Maggie had always been diligent about saving and managing money, but she hadn't been able to shake the sense that something was wrong with the way the household funds were being handled. That's when she found it. The drawer was old, the wood slightly warped with age, but Maggie knew it well. She had never felt the need to rummage through it before. It had always been her husband's drawer filled with receipts and papers. But now, as her fingers pulled the drawer open, she found something she hadn't expected. A stack of bank statements stuffed hastily behind some old receipts. They were in Rachel's name, but Maggie's sharp eyes caught the large, frequent withdrawals that stood out against the other, more routine transactions. Her fingers froze over the paper, her eyes scanning the numbers. Thousands, large amounts. Maggie's breath caught in her chest as she read the familiar name of the local spa, a boutique clothing store she had seen Rachel frequent, and more disturbingly, several charges at high-end restaurants. Rachel's lifestyle was far beyond what Maggie could have imagined. These weren't small indulgences, they were luxuries, indulgences that had no place in the household budget. Maggie's stomach churned. She's been spending our money, Maggie thought, her heart pounding. While I've been saving pennies, she's been living it up. She felt the sting of betrayal deep in her gut, the years of quiet sacrifice suddenly giving way to a sickening realization. Rachel had been pretending to care for her, acting the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law, all while siphoning off funds for her own pleasures. How dare she? Maggie felt the urge to confront Rachel immediately, to call her out, but something stopped her. She wasn't ready, not yet. This wasn't the moment for an outburst. Maggie had learned the hard way that reacting impulsively never served her well. She needed to be strategic. She needed to plan. The decision to stay quiet, to let Rachel continue with her lies for just a little longer, settled over her like a cool, calculated resolve. Maggie tucked the papers back into the drawer, her mind racing. Her emotions a tangle of anger and betrayal, but there was something else, something rising within her, power, a sense that she wasn't the passive victim in this house anymore. I'll make sure she pays for this, Maggie thought, her jaw tightening. Later that week, she met with Tom Reynolds, the estate attorney she had contacted. His office was small, neat, and tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. He greeted her with a polite smile, but Maggie could tell from the moment he shook her hand that he was a man who knew his business. Mrs. Harper, Tom said as they sat across from each other at his desk, I've looked over the documents you provided. You're in a stronger position than you think. Maggie felt a flicker of something, hope perhaps for the first time in days. So I'm not just a guest here, she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. It felt so absurd to even have to ask. Tom smiled reassuringly. No, your name is on the lease, Maggie. The house is legally yours. Maggie exhaled sharply, her mind processing the words. She had always assumed it was John's house, a place where she was allowed to stay out of familial obligation. But this was different. The house was hers. She had a legal right to live there, to stay there, and to protect it. The weight of it settled on her chest, a suffocating relief. It wasn't just the house, it was her life, her independence. She wasn't just another person in the background anymore. She was a legal owner. She could fight back. That's a start then, Maggie said, her voice gaining strength. What do I do next? Tom's face grew serious. Next, we secure your rights, make sure no one can take advantage of you. I'll help you through the next steps, but it's important you don't make any sudden moves. You're in a delicate situation. Maggie nodded, feeling a surge of determination. I'm done with being delicate. The meeting ended with Tom outlining the next steps in a process that felt both daunting and empowering. But as she walked out of his office, Maggie's mind was already planning. She wasn't going to be passive anymore, not after everything she had discovered. Back home, as night crept in and the house fell silent, Maggie sat at the kitchen table once more, her fingers tracing the edges of the papers she had collected, documents that held her future. The next steps were clear. She would use her legal rights and she would make Rachel pay for everything she had stolen from her. But one thing kept gnawing at her, Sophie. Maggie had promised herself that she would secure Sophie's future, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was still so much more to uncover. Rachel wasn't just a threat to Maggie's independence, she was a threat to Sophie's future, too. The phone buzzed on the table, snapping her back to reality. It was Sarah. Hello, Maggie answered, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Maggie, stay focused, Sarah's voice crackled through the line. You've got the legal leverage now, don't let them manipulate you, and above all, don't let them turn you into the villain. Maggie held the phone to her ear, her gaze fixed on the papers in front of her. She felt the weight of her decisions settle deeper in her bones. I won't let them win, not again. Thanks, Sarah, Maggie said softly, the words carrying a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. I won't. I'm done being the villain in their eyes. As she hung up, the sound of the line going dead was like the final click of a lock. The door had closed behind her and there was no turning back. She was done being the victim. And soon, Rachel would know exactly what it meant to cross her. The first light of dawn crept through the kitchen window, casting long fingers of soft light over the papers spread out before Maggie. The quiet of the early morning was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside her. She hadn't slept much, her mind too occupied with the weight of the decisions she was about to make. But now, with the first cup of coffee warming her hands and the house still wrapped in silence, she was ready. The documents in front of her, the lease, the deed to the house, the papers she had meticulously gathered were more than just papers. They were the foundation of her plan. Her name, firmly written on the lease, stared back at her from the top of the first page. It had taken her a long time to realize just how much she had been giving up, how much of herself she had allowed others to control. But now, it was time to reclaim that control. With a deep breath, Maggie reached for the stack of papers. Her fingers traced the lines of legal jargon, names, signatures, and clauses that once felt like a distant, impersonal world. Now, every word, every paragraph felt like a lifeline. She wasn't just living here. This was her home. It always had been, even if she'd never truly acknowledged that truth. The house had always been a source of comfort, a symbol of everything. She had worked for, but for too long it had felt like she was just passing through, taking up space until she became a burden. That all ended now. She'd spent years letting her son and daughter-in-law take the lead, assuming that their decisions were the right ones, but that was no longer the case. Rachel had shown her true colors and John had failed to stand by her. It was time to change the rules of the game. This house is mine. My name is on the lease, Maggie thought, her fingers tightening around the papers in front of her. No one can take that from me. As the morning unfolded, Maggie meticulously went over each document, her mind working in quiet determination. But there was more to be done. Maggie knew she couldn't just rely on the house and her legal rights. She had to think beyond the immediate, beyond just securing her own future. She had to protect Sophie, too. She pulled out a new folder, one she hadn't touched in years. It was filled with notes, numbers, and ideas for a trust fund she had been meaning to set up for Sophie's education. It had always been something she put on the back burner until now. Sophie was the future. Rachel's cruel treatment, her disregard for Maggie's place in the family had made one thing painfully clear. John and Rachel weren't interested in securing Sophie's future. They were too caught up in their own selfishness. Maggie's fingers flew over the papers, scribbling down a plan, how much she wanted to invest, what kind of trust would be best, and how she could ensure that Rachel and John wouldn't be able to touch it. It wasn't just about money, it was about protecting Sophie from the same fate Maggie had endured. She had to ensure that Sophie would never feel as powerless as Maggie had been. But the trust was only one piece of the puzzle. Maggie needed to take back full control of her life, not just her assets. She couldn't keep allowing Rachel to have any hold over her. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became she had to cut the ties emotionally and practically. If she didn't distance herself now, she would only continue to be dragged down by their manipulation. Maggie picked up the phone and dialed Tom Reynolds' number, her fingers steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. She needed to take the next step in securing her home. "Tom," she said when he picked up, "I need to know what it takes to put a legal hold on my assets. I don't want Rachel to have any access to them, not even a little. What can I do to make sure they can't touch my accounts, my property, nothing?" There was a moment of silence on the other end, then Tom's voice came through, measured and calm. "You're in a good position, Maggie. We can establish some stronger legal protections like a trust that limits access to your funds and property, and we can go ahead and set things up so that Rachel and John can't interfere." The words were exactly what Maggie needed to hear. It was all falling into place, one piece at a time. "Make it happen," Maggie said, her voice firm. "I want it done as soon as possible." After hanging up, Maggie leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning with plans and possibilities. For the first time in years, she felt like she had control over her future. It was no longer about waiting for someone else to make the decisions. It was about taking action. Maggie had spent so long watching the world unfold around her, too afraid to take the reins. But now, as she reviewed the list of legal steps she needed to take, she understood the power she held in her hands. "This is my life. No one else gets to dictate it anymore." The clock ticked on, marking the passage of time in a way that felt strangely empowering. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and plans, and realized with a start that it wasn't just the house she had to protect. It was herself. It was her strength, her independence. It was about showing Rachel and everyone else that Maggie Harper wasn't someone to be pushed aside. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. "Stay strong, you've got this. Don't let anyone undermine you." Maggie smiled, a small but fierce smile. She wasn't just going to protect her assets. She was going to protect her soul, her dignity, and her future. And the first step was making sure Rachel's influence ended now. Maggie stood up from the table, pushing the papers aside. It was time to make her move. The house was eerily quiet when Maggie heard Rachel's voice in the hallway, loud, grating, and unmistakably approaching. Maggie's pulse quickened, but there was no fear in her heart. Not anymore. She had spent years avoiding confrontation, always stepping aside for Rachel's sharp words and John's silence. But today, she was done. Maggie stood by the kitchen counter, the bank statement clutched tightly in one hand, her new will and trust documents stacked neatly in the other. Her heart beat steadily, her movements purposeful. She had spent too many years as a passive observer in her own life. Today, she would reclaim her story. She would not back down. The door to the kitchen swung open and Rachel stormed in, her eyes flashing with the same arrogant energy Maggie had grown so used to. "What's this about you making decisions around here?" Rachel sneered. "You've got a lot of nerve." Maggie turned to face her, the papers steady in her hand, her voice calm. "I've got every right to make decisions, Rachel." Her eyes were unflinching. "I'm not leaving this house." Rachel laughed loud, condescending. You think you can stop me?" She crossed her arms, her posture challenging. "What do you think you're doing here, Maggie? You can't just take over. You're not entitled to any of this. This is our home now." Maggie remained still, her voice quiet but firm. "I've been here a lot longer than you think. My name is on the lease, Rachel." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "It's legally mine. I have every right to live here just as much as you do." Rachel's laughter faltered for a moment, but then she smirked. Is that what this is about? You think you can just throw around some papers and make me disappear? You really are pathetic. Maggie stood taller, meeting her daughter-in-law's gaze with unwavering resolve. This isn't about throwing around papers, Rachel. This is about securing what's mine. This is about making sure my future and Sophie's are protected. At that, Rachel's mocking smile faded, but only slightly. Sophie, what about Sophie? Maggie's voice dropped, colder now, as she held up the new will. I'm cutting you out, Rachel. You're no longer part of my plans. Her eyes never wavered from Rachel's. Everything I have will go to Sophie. She's the only one I trust to make something good of it. Rachel's eyes went wide, disbelief written all over her face. You're joking, right? This is insane. You're leaving everything to a child. Maggie's grip tightened on the papers. Sophie's not a child, Rachel. She's the only person who truly understands what family means, the only one who's shown me respect. Everything I have, my house, my assets, will go to her and you'll get nothing. Rachel recoiled as if she'd been slapped, her face flushed with anger, her hands shaking at her sides. You can't do that. You can't take everything away from me. John has a right to it too. He's your son, for God's sake. Maggie's eyes narrowed. John hasn't spoken up. He sat silently while you've treated me like a burden. So no, Rachel, I'm not taking everything away from you. I'm simply ensuring that Sophie's future is secure. Rachel's voice shook with barely contained fury. You're insane. You think this will be the last word? I'm not letting you get away with this. John will make sure you regret this. Maggie didn't flinch. I've waited long enough for John to stand up for me. This is my decision now, not his. She took a step forward, extending the papers to Rachel, her expression cold and resolute. Here, these are my final wishes. You'll have no claim to anything, not even a cent. Rachel's breath quickened as she snatched the papers from Maggie's hand, her fingers trembling. She scanned the will, her face contorting in shock and disbelief with each passing line. You really did it, didn't you? She spat, her voice low and venomous. You really cut me out of everything. Maggie said nothing, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She didn't need to say anything more. She had said it all. Rachel's eyes flickered from the will to Maggie's face, searching for some crack in her resolve, but she found none. With a final, guttural noise of frustration, Rachel flung the papers down on the table, the sharp sound of paper against wood echoing in the stillness. This isn't over. You'll regret this, Maggie, you'll see. Maggie's gaze never wavered, her voice steady. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Rachel. Rachel opened her mouth as though to retort, but no words came out. She stood there, seething, the realization settling in that Maggie had just stripped her of everything she had ever taken for granted. The silence between them grew heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath. With a final glance at Maggie, Rachel turned sharply, her heels clicking angrily against the floor as she stormed out of the room, her fury leaving a palpable tension in the air. Maggie stood alone in the kitchen, the papers in front of her now nothing more than the cold proof of her strength. Her heart still raced, but it wasn't from fear, it was from something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Power, control, freedom. She had taken the first step and Rachel had no idea what she was up against. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in ages, Maggie felt like she was finally in charge. As the door slammed behind Rachel, Maggie couldn't help but think this is just the beginning. Maggie sat in the quiet of the living room, her fingers tracing the edges of the ceramic coffee cup in front of her. The morning light filtered through the windows, the soft warmth of it now a contrast to the chill that had lingered after Rachel's outburst. She had expected anger, but the weight of it, the sheer venom in Rachel's voice, had taken her by surprise. It was a moment Maggie had dreamed of, standing her ground, but now that it had passed, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. She wasn't afraid anymore, though. That part had passed. Now it was time for something new. The decision had been made. There was no going back. Maggie pushed herself out of the chair and walked toward the door, her steps steady, purposeful. As much as Rachel's words had stung, they didn't change the facts. She had the house, she had her legal rights, she had her future in her hands, but she knew she couldn't sit idle and let her fate simply unfold. Her phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting her thoughts. Maggie picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name. It was John. She hesitated, then swiped the screen, bringing the phone to her ear. "John," she said, her voice flat but polite. "Maggie, we need to talk." His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, about what happened. Maggie's grip on the phone tightened. She could already hear Rachel's influence in his voice, the faint trace of guilt that lingered behind his words. "I've made my decision, John," she said, cutting him off. "I don't think there's anything left to say." There was a long pause on the other end. "You don't mean that," John said, his voice carrying a slight edge of desperation. "Mom, Rachel is she's upset. We all said things we didn't mean." I'm not going to pretend anymore," Maggie interrupted, her tone firm. "I'm done. I've spent my life letting you and Rachel dictate everything, and I can't do it anymore. I have to think about my own future now. My future, John." She heard the faintest rustle of papers on the other end of the line and then his quiet sigh. "I don't know what you want me to say, Mom. Rachel's hurt, but she's right. You can't just change everything overnight. This could tear the family apart." Maggie felt a sting in her chest, but she pushed it aside. "It's already been torn apart, John. You just don't want to see it." She paused, letting that sink in. "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm doing what's best for me and for Sophie." John didn't respond immediately, and Maggie didn't expect him to. He had never been the one to stand up for her. She had learned that the hard way. "Goodbye, John," she said softly before ending the call. She stood in the silence that followed, the weight of the conversation heavy in her chest. The finality of it felt both liberating and isolating, but Maggie wasn't going to look back, not anymore. Turning away from the phone, Maggie made her way to the small study in the back of the house, the one she had kept for herself over the years, though it had gathered dust. Now it was her sanctuary, a place to make real changes. She sat at the old wooden desk, the same desk where she had once paid bills, made phone calls, and written letters for the family. It felt like a lifetime ago, but now it was hers again. It was time to reclaim it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she pulled up the financial advisor's number she'd jotted down the day before. It was time to take the next step. "Hello, Mr. Matthews," Maggie said when the call was answered. "Yes, I'd like to set up a meeting. It's time I start looking at my retirement options, my savings, and my future." The advisor agreed to meet later that week, and Maggie felt a small sense of relief. This was what she needed: independence. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how much she had put on hold. She had sacrificed her dreams, her desires, for the sake of the family, but now it was time to invest in herself. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Maggie spent the afternoon organizing her papers, setting up new accounts, and making plans. She took her time, choosing each step carefully. The weight of everything she had endured started to lift, replaced by something new. She had always been so consumed by what others needed from her. Now she was consumed by the thought of what she could do for herself. That evening, Maggie found herself sitting on the porch swing, the cool evening air brushing her skin. Sophie had spent the day at a friend's house, and Maggie had a rare moment of peace. She looked out over the quiet street, a soft smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. When Sophie returned later that night, Maggie met her at the door, wrapping her arms around her granddaughter. "Hey, sweetheart," Maggie said, her voice warm. "I've missed you." Sophie smiled, her eyes lighting up. "I missed you too, Grandma. Did you have a good day?" Maggie nodded, her heart full. "I did. I've been thinking a lot, and I'm going to make sure you have the best future, Sophie, no matter what happens." Sophie looked at her with curiosity, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Maggie smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair away from Sophie's face. "I'm going to make sure you're taken care of, and I'm going to make sure that we are always okay." She held Sophie's gaze for a moment, feeling the weight of the promise she had just made. For the first time in a long time, Maggie felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't just living for others anymore, she was living for herself and for Sophie. And as they walked inside together, Maggie couldn't help but feel a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Joy, freedom, a new beginning. The days after Maggie's confrontation with Rachel felt surreal, like stepping into a world she had only ever watched from the sidelines. There was a quiet power in the air now, something different from the silence she had once endured. It was her silence, her space, her control. But just as quickly as she began to savor her newfound independence, she received a whisper of news that sent a cold ripple through her. Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table, carefully reviewing her retirement plans. The window was open and the afternoon breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the sound of children's laughter from the park across the street. But the peace didn't last. Her phone buzzed and the name on the screen made her stomach tight. It was Sarah. "Maggie, I've just heard something you need to know." Sarah's voice was urgent, laced with an edge of concern. "I've had a local contact tell me that Rachel's been to the landlord's office. She's trying to get the lease changed behind your back." Maggie froze, her pulse quickening. The words hit like a blow. Her hands, which had been lightly resting on the retirement documents, suddenly clenched into fists. What is she trying to do? "She's trying to get your name taken off the lease," Sarah continued, her voice firm. "She's probably trying to push you out legally." The blood drained from Maggie's face. No, this was it, Rachel's final play, and it was as sneaky as it was cruel. Rachel wasn't just attacking Maggie emotionally anymore. She was going after her home, her sanctuary, the very thing Maggie had fought to hold on to. Without a second thought, Maggie stood up, pacing around the kitchen. "I won't let her do this, not now, not after everything." "Do you need me to come over?" Sarah asked, always the steady hand in Maggie's life. "No," Maggie said quickly, her voice steady despite the flood of rage and fear rushing through her. "I'll handle this. I'll call Tom Reynolds, get an injunction. I'm not going to let her steal my home." Her mind raced as she moved to the desk, pulling out the legal papers again. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was because she was in control. She would not let Rachel win, not this time. The phone was already in her hand before she realized it, dialing Tom's number. Her fingers trembled only slightly as the line rang. Tom answered on the third ring. "Maggie, what's going on?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. "Rachel's trying to change the lease behind my back," Maggie said, her voice low but filled with a quiet fury. "I need you to file an injunction. I want to make sure that nothing changes on the property. I'm not letting her get away with this." Tom didn't hesitate. "I'll get on it right away, Maggie. I'll have the paperwork drafted for an emergency injunction this afternoon. We'll stop her." Maggie exhaled, the weight in her chest lifting just slightly. "Thank you, Tom. I'll send over the documents immediately." As she hung up, Maggie moved swiftly, gathering every last piece of paper she could find: bank statements, the will, the deed to the house. Every piece of evidence she had collected over the last few days now even more vital. She had worked too hard for this, and Rachel wasn't going to take it from her. The front door opened with a quiet creak. Maggie's head snapped up, but it was only Sophie, returning from a friend's house. Sophie had no idea what was happening, but Maggie's focus had already shifted. "Hey, Grandma," Sophie's voice broke through the tension in the room, her usual smile lighting up the space. "How's your day been?" "Busy," Maggie said, trying to force a smile. "But I'm fine, I just need to get a few things sorted." Sophie's brow furrowed slightly, sensing something was off, but Maggie didn't have the time to explain. She needed to stay focused. As much as Maggie wanted to explain everything to Sophie, she knew better. She needed to protect her from this mess. Within an hour, Maggie had sent over the necessary documents to Tom's office. He assured her he'd act quickly, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel would keep pushing, testing boundaries until she found a crack to exploit. The phone buzzed again, and Maggie's chest tightened as she saw it was John calling. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. "John." "Maggie, I just talked to Rachel. She's really upset about everything, about you cutting her out of the will and all that. I think you're going too far. Maybe you should reconsider." John's voice wavered between concern and guilt. Maggie's jaw tightened. "John, you've said nothing. You've let Rachel walk all over me for years, and now you want to tell me what to do." Her voice was sharp, more cutting than she intended, but the frustration had built up over time. "This is my decision, and you need to respect it." "But you're hurting the family, Mom." "No, John," Maggie interrupted, her voice a calm storm. "The family has been hurting me for years, and I'm done. I'm not asking for your approval anymore. I'm doing this for myself, for Sophie. I won't apologize for that." There was a long pause, and Maggie could almost hear John's internal battle, but he didn't speak. Instead, the silence on the other end was deafening. Goodbye, John, Maggie said, her voice softer now but resolute. I need to focus on what's best for me, not for Rachel, not for you, for me. She hung up, the finality of it sinking in. The decision had been made. Maggie wasn't going to be manipulated anymore, and as for Rachel, she would fight this to the end. As night began to fall and the quiet of the house settled in, Maggie sat down at the kitchen table again, her fingers tracing the documents that now represented her future. The tension in her body had dissipated, replaced by something stronger. Control, confidence, peace. And as she waited for Tom to call with news of the injunction, Maggie allowed herself a small moment of peace. She was done being the victim. The game had changed, and this time Rachel had no idea what was coming. The afternoon light had started to fade when Rachel burst through the front door, her heels clicking sharply against the floor like a warning. Maggie, who had been sitting at the kitchen table going over her trust documents for the final time, looked up at the sound, her heart steady but her mind racing. She knew this was coming. Rachel had been on edge since the confrontation, but this was different. Rachel's face was flushed with anger, her eyes wide, frantic. I can't believe you're doing this, Maggie. Her voice cracked with a mix of rage and desperation as she slammed the door behind her. You've ruined everything. Maggie didn't flinch, she didn't even stand up. She just calmly closed the folder in front of her and placed it aside. The kitchen, once a place of warmth, now felt like a battlefield. Ruined everything? Maggie asked, her tone even. You mean by standing up for myself, by finally taking control of my own life? Rachel's breath came in short, sharp gasps as if she was trying to contain the storm inside her. You don't get it, do you? You're tearing this family apart. Do you know what you're doing to John, to us? Her voice cracked on the last word, the tears barely held back. He doesn't know how to deal with this. He doesn't know what to do. Maggie could hear the panic in Rachel's voice, the sheer self-centeredness of her accusation. I'm not the one tearing the family apart, Maggie replied, her voice cool but unwavering. You and John have been doing that for years. You've been doing that, Rachel, with your lies and your manipulations. Rachel shook her head violently, her lip trembling as she tried to regain control. This isn't about me, Maggie, it's about the family. You're making it about you, and now we'll all pay the price for it. For what? So you can feel better about yourself? Is this how you're going to leave us? You're just abandoning us, all of us. Maggie's gaze didn't waver from Rachel's frantic face. I'm not abandoning anyone, she said firmly. I'm protecting myself. I've spent too many years giving in to you and John, trying to make myself smaller so you both could feel comfortable, but not anymore. Rachel's fists clenched at her sides, her breathing quickening. She took a step forward, and for a moment Maggie feared Rachel might lash out. Instead, Rachel sank into the chair across from her, her hands trembling in her lap. You're so selfish, she whispered, her voice cracking. You're leaving me with nothing, Maggie. I didn't deserve this. Maggie's heart didn't soften, but there was a slight change in her expression. She had been through too much to let Rachel manipulate her emotions anymore, but part of her, a small part, understood the pain beneath the anger. She could see it, but it didn't change anything. I'm not leaving you with nothing, Maggie replied, her voice quieter but no less firm. You have what you've made for yourself, but I'm no longer responsible for your happiness, Rachel. I'm not responsible for your mistakes. Rachel's tears started to fall, her composure cracking further. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to maintain some semblance of control. What about John? She whispered, barely audible. What's going to happen to him if you do this? You're his mother, Maggie. You can't just… She stopped herself, as though realizing there was no turning back from this. Maggie inhaled slowly, leaning forward just slightly. You've had John's ear for too long. You've manipulated him for so long that he's too scared to speak up. But I won't let you do this anymore, not to him and not to me. Rachel's lip quivered, her breath hitching as she fought back more tears. But Maggie saw the truth now. Rachel wasn't crying because of what she had lost. She was crying because her control over Maggie was slipping away, and that was something Rachel couldn't handle. John's silence had been deafening in the last few days. He hadn't spoken up once, hadn't taken a stand against his wife or defended his mother. Maggie knew that Rachel had him wrapped around her finger, and now that Rachel saw she was losing her grip, she was grasping at straws, trying to keep him tethered to her. Maggie didn't let herself be swayed. She was done being anyone's afterthought. Rachel, you'll find your way, Maggie said, standing up from the table and walking to the window, looking out at the street. John will have to figure out what kind of man he wants to be, and you'll have to figure out how to live without the control you think you've had over me." Rachel sat in stunned silence, her face pale, her expression unreadable for a moment, but Maggie knew that her silence spoke volumes. It wasn't victory, but it was a kind of peace. As Maggie turned back toward Rachel, she felt a calm certainty that she hadn't felt before. This was her decision, and she wouldn't back down. "I'm filing the legal documents tomorrow," Maggie said quietly. "I'll make sure you have no claim on this house, and as for the future, Sophie is my priority now, always." Rachel's eyes darted to the papers on the table, and Maggie saw the shift in her expression. Desperation, yes, but also realization. She knows she's lost this battle. Rachel opened her mouth to speak again, but no words came out. John's voice finally reached them from the doorway. "Rachel, please," he said softly, his face pale and drawn. "Stop, this is over." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "John, you're not going to let her do this, are you?" But John's eyes didn't meet hers, they landed on Maggie instead. And for the first time in years, Maggie saw something in him, a flicker of understanding, perhaps regret, but no apology, no defense. And that was all Maggie needed to see. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Maggie was finally free of their influence, and she wasn't going to look back. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, her hands steady as she signed the final document. The pen felt heavier than it ever had before, each stroke a punctuation to the life she was about to leave behind. She'd spent hours with her attorney, ensuring every line in her will was clear, every detail accounted for. Rachel and John were entirely excluded, no claim to her estate, not a penny. The will was now legally binding, her future and Sophie's secure in ways that felt final and irrevocable. Maggie had made sure to include a trust for Sophie, specifically for her education, one that Rachel would never be able to access. The thought of Sophie's future, protected from the kind of manipulation Rachel had shown, brought a deep, satisfied breath to Maggie's chest. At least Sophie would be safe from this mess. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. The kind of control that Rachel had wielded over John and through him over Maggie, that was over now. Maggie was done being dictated to, done living in the shadows of someone else's drama. The paperwork was all signed, finalized, and ready to be filed. It was a quiet victory, a moment of peace after so much chaos. Maggie looked down at the documents and felt something else, too, empowered. For the first time in years, she had made decisions that were hers. No more justifying herself to John, no more dancing around Rachel's manipulation. She had broken free. But as she placed the final page in the folder, she heard a faint knock at the door. Her heart skipped. She already knew who it was. John. She hadn't seen him since the confrontation. After Rachel's outburst, he had stayed away, hiding in the background as always, but now it seemed he was back to try to patch things up, or so he thought. Maggie didn't need to answer the door, but she did anyway. It was time to face him one last time. Maggie opened the door, and there he stood. He looked tired, a bit defeated, but still carrying that ever-present air of reluctance. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, Maggie saw a flicker of something, maybe regret, maybe fear, but it wasn't enough. "Mom," he said softly, the word dragging out of him as though it cost him something. "I need to talk to you." Maggie leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, not moving to invite him in. "What about John? What's left to say?" John took a breath, his posture shifting slightly as if he wasn't quite sure how to approach her. "Rachel's upset, you know how she gets. She's been trying to get me to see your side, but it's hard for me to just accept everything that's happening." Maggie's jaw tightened. "You've been silent through all of this, John. You've let Rachel control everything. Let her make all the decisions. I'm not interested in hearing you defend her anymore. You need to start thinking for yourself." John flinched at the sharpness in her voice, but Maggie didn't care. She wasn't here to soften the blow anymore. "I've spent my life making myself smaller for you two, for your comfort, but not anymore. I'm done." "I'm not taking sides, Mom," John said, his voice low. "I just don't want to lose my family. I don't know what to do." Maggie felt the sting of his words, the weight of the years of passive silence that had hung between them. "You've already lost it, John. This family, the one you're trying to hold together, isn't the same anymore. You've chosen your side. You chose Rachel's over mine." John didn't respond, but his eyes betrayed him. Maggie saw it. He was torn, unsure of how to reconcile his loyalties, but it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't going to stand up for her. He never had. Maggie's gaze softened, but only just. It's too late for that now, John. I've made my peace with it. This is about my future and about Sophie's. I don't need to explain myself to you or Rachel anymore. John swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. I know, I just wanted to make sure you knew I wasn't trying to hurt you. Maggie smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. It's not about me anymore, John. It never was. With that, John turned to leave, his shoulders heavy, his steps slow. Maggie stood in the doorway watching him go and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He had chosen his path and it no longer intersected with hers. As the door clicked shut, Maggie turned back to the table. Her heart felt lighter now that the weight of John's indecision was gone. She had been ready for this moment for a long time. The truth was clear and it was time to move forward. She gathered the trust and will documents, setting them in her bag. Sophie would be safe. She would have the future Maggie had always wanted for her, one that wasn't tied to the toxicity of Rachel and John's world. The air felt different now, like a storm had passed and left a quiet calm in its wake. Maggie wasn't looking back anymore. Tomorrow she'd file everything. Tomorrow she'd make it official. And from that moment on, she would live her life as she saw fit, free from the grip of a family that had never really understood her. For the first time in years, Maggie felt peace, true peace. And she knew without a doubt that this was just the beginning. The day after Maggie's conversation with John, the weight of it still lingered in the air like an unfinished note hanging in the silence of the house. She had spoken her truth, and while she knew it was the right thing to do, there was a quiet sorrow inside her that she hadn't expected. She had loved John with a fierce maternal devotion, and to see him choose Rachel's side, however passively, cut deeper than she cared to admit. But in the quiet aftermath, there was also something else: relief. The burden of unspoken words, of unanswered questions, was finally lifted. John's silence had spoken volumes, and Maggie had heard it loud and clear. She sat at the kitchen table again, this time with no distractions. The house was still and calm, as if the very walls had exhaled with her. She had made her decision, and now it was time to move forward, for herself, for Sophie. Her phone buzzed on the table, dragging her out of her thoughts. Maggie Glan. Set at the screen, it was John again. She debated picking it up, but the truth was she didn't want to, not anymore. The conversation had been had and there was nothing left to say. Instead, Maggie stood, her body suddenly feeling lighter, as if the weight of years of trying to hold things together had melted off her shoulders. She walked to the window, her fingers brushing the edges of the cool glass. The world outside seemed unchanged, but Maggie felt the shift within herself. She was free. The house no longer felt like a prison. For the first time, it felt like hers, truly hers. Every decision, every future step she would take was in her own hands. Later that evening, as the light outside began to fade and the quiet hum of the neighborhood settled around her, Sophie arrived home. Maggie had been expecting it, the gentle sound of the front door creaking open, Sophie's familiar footsteps on the floor. She turned to find her granddaughter standing in the doorway, her face a picture of concern and uncertainty. "Grandma," Sophie's voice trembled slightly, "are you okay?" Maggie smiled softly, her heart swelling with warmth. She opened her arms, inviting Sophie in for a hug. Sophie rushed into her embrace, clinging tightly as if afraid the world outside might swallow her whole. Maggie could feel her granddaughter's weight in her arms, but it wasn't the burden Maggie had been carrying for years. It was a comfort. Sophie was her anchor, and Maggie was going to protect her, no matter the cost. "I'm okay, sweetheart," Maggie whispered, brushing a strand of hair away from Sophie's face. "I'm more than okay, I'm free." Sophie pulled back slightly, her eyes wide with concern. "What happened, Grandma? Why are you so different? You don't seem sad anymore." Maggie's heart ached at the rawness of Sophie's words. "I've been holding on to a lot of things, sweetie, a lot of things that weren't mine to carry, but now I'm going to focus on what really matters." She cupped Sophie's face gently. "You, Sophie, you matter most." Sophie smiled, the relief washing over her like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. "I want to help you, Grandma. I want to make sure you're happy. We'll be okay, right?" Maggie nodded, the certainty in her chest solidifying. "We will be, darling, we'll be more than okay." Later that night, Maggie sat down to review her plans. She had already made her peace with John and Rachel, but now it was time to plan for the future. She pulled out her retirement papers, her will, and the trust documents she had prepared for Sophie's education. It felt surreal to think that this was the new reality. A future without Rachel and John's interference, where Maggie could finally focus on herself, on healing, on living for the first time in years. As Maggie went over the documents one last time, her phone buzzed once more. It was John. Again. She stared at the screen, the temptation to pick it up strong, but she didn't, not this time. She had already said everything that needed to be said. John had made his choice, and now she had to make hers. Maggie put the phone down and took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the moment settle over her. She wasn't going to beg anyone for love or attention anymore. She wasn't going to fight for a place at the table that had always been uncomfortably small. She had a new table now, one that she could build for herself and Sophie. Maggie stood up, moving toward the door that led out into the small garden in the back. She opened it slowly, letting the cool evening air wash over her. For the first time, she felt like she was standing on solid ground, like she had a future, not just a past. As she stepped into the garden, her feet firm on the earth beneath her, Maggie realized something. This wasn't just about breaking away from Rachel and John. This was about finding herself again after all the years of feeling lost. She was more than just a mother, a grandmother, or a daughter-in-law. She was Maggie. And now, for the first time in a long time, Maggie could breathe. She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "We're going to be okay, Sophie," she whispered to herself, her voice carried away by the breeze. And somehow Maggie knew it was true. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living, and it felt like the first step toward a whole new life. The door closed behind her softly, and the garden, still and serene, embraced her like the future she had finally stepped into. The morning light slanted through the open windows, casting long, lazy beams across the living room. The house was quiet, peaceful, an ordinary morning that, for Maggie, felt extraordinary. She sipped her coffee slowly, the warmth of the cup grounding her as she took in the stillness of the space around her. It wasn't the kind of silence that had once felt oppressive, like the house was closing in on her. No, this was different. This was hers. Maggie had spent so many years waiting for things to happen, waiting for John to step up, waiting for Rachel's cruelty to stop, waiting for someone to notice her sacrifices. But now there was no more waiting. The world felt open, the possibilities endless. She had fought hard for this, for her space, for her peace. She had taken her life back, and for the first time in years, Maggie could feel the warmth of a life lived on her own terms. She had already started filling her days with things that brought her joy, things that had once been lost beneath the weight of family obligations. She spent mornings in the garden, tending to the flowers that had been neglected for far too long. Her hands, once stiff from the years of strain, now moved freely, finding comfort in the rhythm of the earth. She'd forgot how much she loved the feeling of soil beneath her fingers, how the act of nurturing something small could bring such peace. Afterward, Maggie would lose herself in a good book. Reading had always been a love of hers, but it had fallen by the wayside during her years of self-sacrifice. Now she devoured novels like they were a lifeline, escaping into worlds where she could be anyone, anywhere. She'd read more in the last month than she had in the past 5 years. The stories were more than just distractions. They were a reminder that life still had so much to offer, so much to be explored. And then there were the days she spent volunteering at the local shelter, helping women who were rebuilding their lives just as she had. Maggie had always been a caregiver, but it was different now. She gave from a place of abundance, not exhaustion. There was something deeply fulfilling in seeing the faces of the women she helped, hearing their stories, and knowing that in some small way she was making a difference. Sophie thrived too. Maggie had watched her granddaughter grow more confident with each passing day. With Maggie's future now secure, Sophie was free to focus on what truly mattered, her education, her dreams. Sophie's laughter filled the house more often, a sound that Maggie never took for granted. She had promised to always be there for Sophie, and now she could. For the first time, Sophie didn't have to worry about the weight of family tension. She could simply be a kid, a teenager, full of hope and promise. And Maggie would protect that with everything she had. The changes weren't just external, they ran deeper into the very core of Maggie's being. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. The freedom to make her own choices had awakened something within her, a confidence she hadn't known she had. She was building a future that was entirely hers, no longer bound by the expectations of a family that had never understood her. On weekends, she and Sophie would go on little adventures, exploring the town, visiting the local art museum, or taking walks through the nearby park. There were moments when Maggie would stop, close her eyes, and listen to the sound of birds overhead, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the laughter of children in the distance. It was a reminder that life in its simplicity could be so beautiful. Maggie had always been someone who lived for others, her son, her daughter-in-law, even Sophie in many ways. But now she was learning how to live for herself, to embrace the things she loved without guilt, without fear. She had spent so long trying to be what others needed her to be, trying to fix things that weren't hers to fix. Now she was finally free to be her. She found herself laughing more often now, laughter that came easily without the tightness in her chest that had once accompanied it. She no longer felt like she had to hold herself back, to tiptoe around the edges of other people's needs. For the first time, Maggie was fully present in her own life. One evening, as she and Sophie sat on the porch, the sun setting low on the horizon, Sophie turned to her, her expression thoughtful. "Grandma, you're really different now, you're happier, aren't you?" Maggie smiled, her heart swelling. "Yes, sweetheart, I think I am." Sophie nodded slowly as if processing the change. "I'm glad, you deserve to be happy." Maggie's heart clenched in her chest. "And so do you, darling, you deserve everything the world has to offer." The quiet between them felt comfortable, peaceful. There were no more unspoken words hanging in the air, no more tension that needed to be managed. Just the sound of crickets in the distance, the hum of a world that kept turning, indifferent to everything but the beauty it held. For the first time in so long, Maggie didn't feel the need to control anything. She didn't need to fix anyone, didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. She had done the hardest thing she'd ever had to do: let go. Let go of Rachel's manipulations, of John's indifference, of the family dynamics that had kept her small. And in letting go, she had found herself. Maggie looked out at the horizon, the sky fading to dusk, and felt a deep, satisfying peace wash over her. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was hers to build. And for the first time, Maggie didn't just believe it, she knew it. And as the stars began to appear overhead, she whispered softly to herself, "This is just the beginning." Maggie sat on the porch swing, the early evening air cool against her skin as she watched Sophie chase fireflies across the yard. The sky had just begun to darken, the stars twinkling faintly in the distance, and the world felt more alive than it had in years. She had always loved moments like this, quiet, simple, where everything felt like it was exactly as it should be. But tonight there was a new feeling creeping into her chest, something unfamiliar and yet undeniably free. For the first time in so long, Maggie felt whole. It was then that the phone rang. Maggie didn't need to look at the screen, she knew who it was. "Hello, Maggie?" Rachel's voice on the other end of the line was strained, softer than Maggie had ever heard it before. I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with history, with all the years of resentment, manipulation, and hurt that had built up between them. Maggie didn't speak for a moment, her thoughts quiet and still. The woman who had once been part of her family, who had been a daughter-in-law and more, was now a stranger, standing outside the life Maggie had finally reclaimed. "I'm sorry for everything, Maggie," Rachel continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been awful. I didn't realize how much I hurt you. I was wrong." Maggie's grip on the phone tightened. There was a part of her that wanted to believe Rachel, that wanted to hear her say the right things, to apologize in a way that would make it all feel right. But Maggie knew better now. She had learned the hard way that apologies, no matter how sincere they sounded, didn't undo years of cruelty. They didn't undo the damage that had been done. "Rachel, I've heard enough," Maggie said, her voice steady and calm. "I've heard all of this before and I've made my peace. You don't get to come back into my life now and undo everything that's happened." The silence on the other end of the line felt long, suffocating, as if Rachel had no words left. Maggie could almost hear her trying to come up with something, anything that would make it all okay again. But Maggie wasn't interested in hearing it anymore. She wasn't interested in making space for someone who had only ever taken. "I don't need your apology," Maggie continued, her voice a quiet strength. "What I needed was for you to be a better person, for you to treat me with respect. And you never did, so this is it, I'm done." There was a soft sob from Rachel, but Maggie remained unmoved. She had already grieved for the woman who had never truly been a part of her life. She had already let go of the false hope that somehow, someday, Rachel would change. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Maggie," Rachel said, her voice breaking. I just want you to know I'm sorry." Maggie closed her eyes, letting the quiet night air wash over her. She didn't need to hold on to this anger anymore. Rachel had made her choice, and Maggie had made hers. "Goodbye, Rachel," she said softly, and with that she hung up the phone. The moment the call ended, Maggie felt something lift from her chest. It was as though a final weight had been released, the last piece of the puzzle clicking into place. She wasn't angry, she wasn't sad, she was just free. She turned her attention back to Sophie, who had stopped running and was standing still, staring up at her with a bright smile. The glow from the fireflies lit her face in. A way that reminded Maggie of how much had changed, how far they had come together. Maggie walked over to her granddaughter, the warmth of her love for Sophie filling her up like never before. "Grandma, I'm glad you're happy," Sophie said, her voice full of that youthful excitement that Maggie cherished. Maggie smiled and took Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. "Me too, sweetheart, me too." As they walked back into the house, Maggie felt something solidify within her. This wasn't just about cutting Rachel out of her life. It was about cutting out all the toxicity that had kept her bound in place for so long. The lies, the manipulation, the constant need to be something she wasn't for the sake of others, it was all gone. The new chapter Maggie had begun was one that was all hers. And no one, not Rachel and certainly not John, would take that from her. The house was quieter now, more peaceful, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. And Maggie knew, without a doubt, that she was stronger than she had ever thought possible. She had taken control of her life, and in doing so, she had found her peace. The future was hers, she would live it on her own terms, and Sophie would live hers without the shadows of the past hanging over her. Maggie had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Her happiness was in her own hands now, and that felt more powerful than anything Rachel or John could ever say. As they entered the kitchen, Sophie slipped her arm through Maggie's, and for the first time, Maggie realized just how much her granddaughter had become her anchor. The love between them was enough to fill any void, to heal any wound. Together, they could face anything. Maggie smiled, the quiet resolve settling over her like a warm blanket. Tomorrow, she would take the next step in building her future with Sophie by her side, and with that, she knew her life was exactly where it was meant to be. The phone buzzed on the counter again, but Maggie ignored it. It was Rachel, and it was John. It was her now. And that was all that mattered. The soft light of the morning filtered in through the window, illuminating the room where Maggie sat, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. The house was still, the kind of stillness that now felt comforting, not unsettling. The weight she'd carried for so long of betrayal, guilt, and an unrelenting need to prove herself was finally gone. In its place, a new sense of peace had taken root, one she had earned through the hardest battles of her life. The papers were spread out in front of her, a simple yet powerful testament to the new life she was building. Her hand hovered over them for a moment, her thoughts settling in as she reread the words on the documents she had worked tirelessly to prepare. The trust for Sophie's future was now official. Her legacy would be one of strength, independence, and above all, protection for the granddaughter she loved with every fiber of her being. She thought back to the years she'd spent tiptoeing around Rachel's manipulation, around John's silence. How many times had she put her needs aside for the sake of the family? Too many. The Maggie who had walked into that storm was a woman bound by guilt, by the weight of others' expectations. But the Maggie who sat at the table now was free, her heart light, her spirit strong. Maggie had built this new legacy herself. There was no one to thank but her own resolve. The thought of Sophie's future, secure and free from Rachel's influence, filled her with an indescribable satisfaction. Sophie deserved this, the chance to grow up without the shadows of a toxic family dynamic clouding her potential. Maggie had fought for this for them, and now it was real. Her pen moved with purpose as she signed the final pieces of paperwork, officially cementing the future she had promised to Sophie. The trust was set. Sophie's future was bright. There was no longer any question of Rachel's influence over her. Rachel had no claim to this, no claim to the life Maggie had so carefully crafted. It was a quiet victory, but it was everything Maggie needed. Her fingers traced the edges of the documents, lingering for a moment on the signature line. It was more than just a name written in ink, it was a declaration. A declaration of Maggie's new life, one she had taken for herself. She stood, gathering the papers and placing them in a folder to be filed. The finality of it hit her all at once, but it wasn't heavy. It was freeing. This was no longer about what others expected or demanded from her. This was about Maggie, the woman who had been lost for so many years but had now found her way back. The door opened softly and Sophie appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with the kind of wonder that only a child could carry. She had been waiting for this day, just as Maggie had. "Grandma, is everything ready?" Sophie asked, her voice full of hope and curiosity. She had come to understand in her own way what this all meant, that Maggie was setting things right, that Sophie's future was secure no matter what. Maggie nodded, her heart swelling. "Yes, darling, it's all done, your future is safe, and no one, not even Rachel, can take that from you." Sophie's face lit up, a smile spreading across her features, her excitement palpable. "I'm so glad, Grandma, I knew you would do it." Maggie smiled back, her chest tight with emotion. We did it together, sweetheart, we're a team. Sophie crossed the room quickly, throwing her arms around Maggie in a tight hug. Maggie held her close, feeling the warmth of her granddaughter's embrace, the pure joy of knowing that Sophie would never have to go through the same struggles Maggie had endured. As they pulled apart, Sophie's eyes sparkled. So what now, Grandma? What are we going to do next? Maggie stood there for a moment, thinking, her heart racing with possibilities. There was no more waiting, no more putting her life on hold for the sake of others. Now, Maggie said, a soft smile tugging at her lips, we live, we take this new life we've built and make the most of it, together. They walked outside into the garden, the sun now fully risen, casting its golden light across the landscape. Maggie felt the earth beneath her feet, solid and real, just like the life she had rebuilt. It was hers to shape, hers to enjoy, and no one, not Rachel, not John, could take that from her anymore. Maggie stopped for a moment, letting Sophie run ahead to the garden's edge, the cool breeze playing with her hair. Maggie felt a sudden rush of clarity, as though everything had come full circle. She had spent so many years letting others control her story, but now she was the author. She was in control. She glanced over at Sophie, her heart full. This is what I've been fighting for, she thought. This is the life I was meant to live. Maggie had done the hard work, and now it was time to savor the freedom, the joy, and the peace she had fought so long to find. The future stretched out before them, bright and promising. Maggie smiled to herself as she watched Sophie, her laughter ringing out across the garden. For the first time in years, Maggie could finally look ahead, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready. And she would face it on her own terms. The auditorium was filled with a hum of anticipation, a buzz of voices that slowly quieted as the event began. Maggie stood at the back of the room, waiting her turn. The air felt heavy with excitement, but there was also something else, the weight of her own story, ready to be shared with a room full of women who had walked their own difficult paths. For years, Maggie had kept her story to herself, buried beneath the weight of family obligations and personal sacrifice. But now, standing at the cusp of something new, she felt a quiet power rising within her. This was her moment, her chance to stand tall and share the strength she had found. Sophie sat beside her, eyes wide with admiration. Maggie caught her granddaughter's gaze and smiled. Sophie's pride in her was evident, and Maggie couldn't help but feel a rush of gratitude for the young woman who had helped pull her through the darkest moments. It was for Sophie that Maggie had fought so hard, for her future, her happiness, her freedom. And today, Sophie was here to see her grandmother's triumph. As Maggie's name was called, she stepped forward, her heart steady, her breath deep. She could feel the eyes of the audience on her, but she no longer felt small. She no longer felt like she had to shrink to make others comfortable. This was her space, her voice, her truth. Standing at the podium, Maggie took a moment to gather her thoughts. The lights were bright, but the warmth they offered didn't compare to the warmth in her chest. She could feel the echo of every challenge, every moment she had felt lost and then found. She could feel the years of struggle, but also the immense strength that had come from overcoming them. Good afternoon, Maggie began, her voice clear and strong. I'm here today because I've learned something very important, that it's never too late to find yourself, to change your story, and to start living for you. The words flowed easily now, each sentence stronger than the last. She spoke of the years she had spent in silence, of the manipulation, the guilt, and the loneliness. But she also spoke of the moment she had chosen to reclaim her life, when she decided finally to let go of the past and build something entirely new. I was a mother, a wife, a daughter-in-law. I spent years believing I was meant to live for everyone else, Maggie continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, her words for each of them. But in the end, I realized I had been living for them at the cost of my own happiness, my own freedom. I had to learn that it's okay to let go, to put yourself first, to let your own dreams rise to the surface. As she spoke, Maggie could feel the weight of her journey lifting off her shoulders. It was no longer something she had to carry in secret. She had come through it, stronger, wiser, and more confident than she'd ever thought possible. And now, in this room full of women, she realized how many others shared that same strength, that same power to rebuild. Maggie paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. She felt Sophie's presence beside her, steady and full of support. Maggie's eyes glistened as she looked out at the women in the audience, women who had faced their own battles and emerged stronger. It was in that moment that Maggie understood the true meaning of community, of shared strength. The journey she had taken wasn't just hers alone, it belonged to all of them. I'm proud of the woman I've become, Maggie said, her voice steady with conviction. I'm proud of the life I've rebuilt, and I'm especially proud that I've built it for the people who matter most, my granddaughter Sophie. Sophie's face lit up in the audience, her smile radiating with pride. Maggie's heart swelled as she looked at her, the love between them an unspoken bond that filled the room with warmth. Sophie was more than just her anchor, she was the reason Maggie had fought so hard. And now, standing here, Maggie realized that the future she had promised to Sophie was a future that belonged to both of them, a future of freedom, independence, and endless possibility. As Maggie wrapped up her speech, the applause that filled the room was overwhelming. It was a sound she had longed to hear but had never allowed herself to truly believe she deserved. The support, the respect, it was all there surrounding her in waves. She stood tall, accepting it, knowing deep down that this was her victory, one that no one could take away. After the event, Maggie and Sophie stood together in the lobby, surrounded by women who came to thank her for sharing her story, who spoke of their own journeys, their own battles. Maggie listened, offering words of encouragement, and as she did, she realized how much further her story could go, how many other lives she could touch, how many other women could find strength in her words. As the event began to wind down, Maggie stepped outside into the cool night air, Sophie by her side. The stars above were bright, the world around them still, and Maggie felt a deep sense of peace settle in her chest. She had come so far, she had built something real, something lasting, and now she could look ahead with excitement, knowing that the rest of her journey was just beginning. "I'm so proud of you, Grandma," Sophie said, her voice full of awe. "You did it." Maggie smiled, her heart full. "No, sweetheart, we did it." As they walked back to the car, Maggie couldn't help but feel that for the first time in her life she was truly living on her own terms, with her own power and her future shining bright in front of her. This was her legacy now, a legacy of strength, courage, and a love that could never be broken. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, casting a warm amber glow across the street as Maggie walked down the quiet sidewalk. The familiar sound of her footsteps against the pavement echoed in the stillness, but this time it felt different. Each step, each breath felt lighter, more deliberate. She no longer rushed to get through the day, she was savoring every moment, taking in the peace that had eluded her for so long. She smiled to herself, thinking of the journey she had made. From the suffocating weight of her past, from the tangled webs of betrayal, to this, a life of peace, strength, and independence. She had earned this. Every choice, every sacrifice had led her to this place, and it was hers. No one could take it from her now. The breeze stirred the leaves of the trees lining the street, a soft whisper in the growing night. Maggie took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. She thought of Sophie, her granddaughter, who was thriving in ways Maggie had only dreamed of for her. Sophie's future was no longer clouded by uncertainty, no longer caught in the web of Rachel's manipulation. Sophie would grow up free, free to dream, to explore, to be whoever she wanted to be. Maggie couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment as she thought about the life she had built for Sophie. It wasn't just a future secured financially, though that was important. It was the peace of mind knowing that Sophie would never have to carry the weight of toxic family dynamics like Maggie had. Sophie was safe, loved, and protected, and Maggie had made that happen. She had survived the storm, the years of emotional manipulation, the guilt of constantly putting herself last, the struggle to be seen and heard by those who never truly understood her. But now in this new life, Maggie had found herself again. She had found her voice, her confidence, her strength. And with that came a kind of peace that she had never known before. The burden had been lifted and the chains of the past had been broken. Maggie paused at the corner of the street, her gaze lifting to the sky, now dark and full of stars. The weight of everything she had endured felt distant, like a story that wasn't hers anymore. She was no longer the woman who had allowed herself to be controlled, no longer the woman who had believed that her worth was defined by the approval of others. She had taken back her life, and now, for the first time, she could live for herself. Her footsteps resumed, more certain now. She was walking home, but not to the home she had once known. This was a new home, a home where she was free, where she called the shots, where she no longer had to make herself smaller for anyone else. She had built this space for herself, and no one could take it away. As she walked through the front door, Maggie felt a wave of contentment wash over her. The house was quiet, serene, a sanctuary she had created, a place that reflected the woman she had become. Sophie was already in bed, no doubt dreaming of the future, just as Maggie had once dreamed of a life that felt right, and now that life was here. Maggie walked into the kitchen and poured herself another cup of coffee, savoring the quiet hum of the house. Everything felt in place, everything felt good. She had faced the hardest battles of her life and come out stronger on the other side. The darkness, the manipulation, the fear, they were behind her now. She turned to the window, gazing out at the moonlit yard, the same yard where Sophie had run and laughed not so long ago. Maggie's heart swelled with pride. She had made this possible. It was her strength, her courage, her decisions that had turned the page to this new chapter. She hadn't just survived, she had thrived. And in the stillness of the night, Maggie realized that the legacy she was leaving behind wasn't just one of financial security or legal documents. It was one of strength, courage, and wisdom. She had shown Sophie what it meant to stand tall, to take control of her life, and to never let anyone dictate her worth. Maggie had created a life that wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about rising from it and flourishing in the sunlight that followed. As Maggie walked upstairs, her steps light and confident, she passed by the room that had once been filled with so much tension, so much uncertainty. Now it was just another room in a house that was her own. No one could take that from her, not anymore. She stood in the doorway of Sophie's room, watching her granddaughter sleep soundly, her face peaceful in the moonlight. Maggie smiled softly, her heart full of love. "This is for you, Sophie," she thought. "This life, this peace, it's all for you." As Maggie turned to leave, she glanced back one last time, taking in the quiet serenity of the house she had reclaimed. She had weathered the storm, and now, finally, she was at peace. There would be no more doubts, no more guilt. Her life was hers, and nothing could take that away. And then, as if it had all come full circle, Maggie couldn't help but think of the words Rachel had once screamed in fury, the words that had sparked everything. "Get her out, she's just an old leech." The irony of it all settled over Maggie like a quiet victory. Rachel had no idea whose name had been on the lease, and now no one could take it from her. Maggie closed the door softly behind her, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. This was her life, and it was exactly what she had fought for. "Get her out, she's just an old leech," Rachel screamed. She didn't know whose name was on the lease, and now no one could take it from me.